So, hello everyone. Good morning from people in Hong Kong and good evening for those who are in the States. I am Cousin Chang, the curator of the exhibition Retrograde at Galerie du Monde, Hong Kong. Very nice to see all of you in this Zoom for the first Art to Talk in Retrograde. Here we have artists Guanyu, Gary, and Rachel Youn. Gary is currently based in Chicago and Rachel is currently based in St. Louis. So I think before we go through all the details of the talk, I think it will be nice to go through some of the things that we're going to talk about in this talk. So first of all, actually, this is a wonderful opportunity for everyone to be able to learn more about the practices of Gary's and Rachel's. This is the first time for Gary to show in Hong Kong, and actually first time for Rachel to showcase in Asia. So it's a wonderful opportunity for every one of us who has the chance to visit the show to see their works. So we'll start with a sort of deep dive of the artist's practices and creative process, and we'll go through certain more personal topics such as experience of Asian queer artists, their ambivalent relationship with their family, identity struggles, symbolic violence, and aesthetic failure. So after the discussion with the artists, we will have around 10 minutes of Q&A section at the end. So you can feel free to leave your questions in the comment section and the gallery team will compile and gather. We will get back to them at the end of the talk. So I think for those who still hasn't visited the exhibition, I think it will be great to give you a little bit brief introduction of the whole exhibition. So the show Retrograde questions about the normative mainstream movement of the LGBT community. And we really try to highlight different alternative subjectivities, ways of dealing with history, and imagining future through the lens of queerness. So in this exhibition, we have 11 artists from all over the world. We have Ivana Basic, Jazz Fan, Dio Kim, Green Mock, Narafat Seconds on Sub, Chen Qianying, Florian Varenne, Louis Sertu, Guanyu, Rachel Youn, and Stella Zhang. Actually, 10 of the artists in this show is first-time collaborators with the gallery, and more than half are debuting in Hong Kong or Asia. So it's a very ambitious project and also very meaningful. And so if you actually have a chance to visit the show in person, please feel free to come by. So here you see, I tried to curate an exhibition that really involves with various different artwork mediums. We have paintings, sculptures, installations, photography, and even video works. So it's not only in terms of, there's a diversity, not in terms of the artist, but also in terms of the artwork mediums. And in this exhibition, I try to really play with the space and create different juxtapositions and intersections of private and public spaces, but also the viewing experience is also quite interesting because you can really see the connections of the artworks through perhaps the installation in the center of the show, or you can kind of create like the connections between in terms of the use of color, the use of motif. So it's a very fun experience to see the show, and it's very interactive as well. So in this exhibition, I tried to pair up Gary's photographs with Rachel's kinetic installation. So I think it will be nice if Gary and Rachel, you guys can introduce yourself a little bit to our audience and participants, and then we will go with Gary first in terms of the sharing. So Gary, would you mind sharing your artistic practice and creative process to us?
Okay, thank you so much, cousin. And thank you, Galerie du Monde, for including me in this show. So my name is Guanyu Xu, and some people know me. I sometimes go by Gary, and either way works for me. I'm currently based in Chicago, and I went to school in School for Institute of Chicago here in Chicago. I'm currently working as an artist and also teaching at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. My practice are mainly photography, but sometimes I incorporate photography with new media, video installation. And I'm really interested in how do I figure out and dissect relationship between China and the US, understanding how my personal identity and freedom is entangled with the two, and how personal freedom is controlled and governed by these states. So that's something that I'm really interested in, and it's also reflected in Temporarily Censored Home, the two works that's included in the group show.
Thank you, Gary. So I will definitely go through all the details you mentioned. So Rachel, would you mind also introduce yourself a bit?
Yeah, thanks, cousin, and Galerie du Monde, and everybody who's here either late at night or in the morning. But yeah, I'm Rachel. So I'm an artist based in St. Louis. I'm actually about to relocate to New Haven this fall to start school. But yeah, I primarily identify as a sculptor, and I work with sculpture and installation. What I'm currently practicing with is mainly kinetic sculpture. So if you come to see the work in this show, you'll see that these pieces move and gyrate and kind of bash against each other. I'm really interested in kind of letting these sculptures express themselves, but using motors from basically used massagers, these really kind of personal appliances that you apply to your body in order to provide comfort and healing, and basically to substitute the touch of a human, and then kind of releasing them from those roles, because they've been resold, they've been kind of discarded, or repurposed. And then, yeah, attaching these plants to them, whether those are flowers or like kind of tropical plants, which end up doing these kind of crazy, like they're interpreted as dances, but oftentimes kind of get into these like violent twists. And yeah, sometimes they're paired with music, oftentimes in a bigger installation setting.
Yay. So I think for the first section of the talk, we can go with Gary's practices first, and then we will go for Rachel's details. So Gary, very grateful to be able to include 2 works from the series Temporary Censored Home. In Retrograde, we have 2 works. One is Space of Mutation from 2018 and Open Closets in 2019. So here in the shared deck, this is actually the work Space of Mutation. So I would like to start, to understand a bit more of how you come up with this kind of unique way of making photography works, because as everyone can see, Gary's works use the collage technique, but different from most of the artists, Gary didn't apply the technique on top of the photograph, but actually it's during the process. So definitely would love to know how you come up with this way of creating photographs.
Sorry, I was muted. So yeah, I think that kind of came from probably 2 perspectives. So the first thing that I think at the time when I was thinking about making this work, I was particularly thinking about how do I bring my practice back to home? Like how do I show my work that I made in the US back to my home? And that's mainly these portraiture that I made in the US with other men. And this kind of performative stage portraitures and those acts towards the camera. And here you can see at the lower bottom part, you see like me with another man in his bed. And the photograph is made in Los Angeles. So there are a lot of these images I made from 2014 to 2018. So I was thinking about like, how do I bring those images back? Because at the same times, my family, my parents, they are always asking me like what type of work I make in US. Like they, because I mean they pay for my tuition. I mean this is just, maybe it's my family, but I feel like that probably some Asian family also do that. That like your relative also somehow gave you a little bit money to, if you go to study in college or go abroad, they also like chip in some of the money, just like whether it's for tuition or it's for just like make your life a little bit easier, abroad. So like people will ask me what kind of work I make, and I always just tell them that, just like this random landscape that I take. And so I was thinking, what if I actually bring these images back to my country and back to my home, and use that as an exhibit that in my home. So that's kind of a little bit kind of personal reasoning and personal inspiration that I had. But of course, I think another aspect of the thinking was kind of considering how do I understand photography, or how do I understand image and its meaning, and how it generates desires through my life. So from really early on, that was in Beijing when I grew up, I consumed so much, Hollywood-made films, TV shows, and I collect so many fashion magazines, film magazines that's kind of talk about Western culture. And those pages also included in the the installation that you can see here. So you see that stack of magazine that I included in the lower left corner of the work. So that's also something that I was thinking about, how these imagery affected me and influenced my desire to appreciate, the American dream, the idea of democracy, the idea of what desired body looks like, who's desired, and how does homosexual practice works, whatever that means. But to be honest, the time when I received those information was predominantly quite homonormative. And like, for instance, thinking about An Lee's film Broken Back Mountain, right? Like this Asian world famous director decide to direct a gay film, but it's mainly just like these two good looking straight actors performing for all the rest of the world. What, how suffering can gay life be, right? Like these kind of narratives are kind of hidden in like, there's like the hidden ideology that's I guess prevent me as a person of color and coming from a quite different cultural practice. So that's something that I didn't really realize until I came to the States and studied in SIC in a more kind of critical environment. So I started to realize, how should I understand imagery? How do I understand their ideology, and how they affect our desire, our action, our relationship to the world. So that's something that I was thinking about when I decided to eventually migrate images that I made in the US back to my home and to renegotiate its meaning. But also it gave me access to not only renegotiate my relationship to my family home, the space I grew up in, but also questioning these kind of naive belief in these images I collected since when I was, teenage years, but also images that I made in the US that to counter that narrative. So I think that's something that I was thinking when I began the work. But of course, I was really influenced by, photographer like Wolfgang Tillmans, who's been doing those exhibitions through years, and of course, installation artists like Sarah Z, Thomas Horshorn, and they are, to me, really influential as an kind of artistic reference.
Thank you. So I think there are two quite interesting elements in this work that I think the audience may be curious to know. So I remember you told me this is one of the work, if not the only work, that you are personally captured in a photo, because you can see like on the left-hand side, I believe this is you and your hand. So, but I remember the other photographs in the series, I don't think you're particularly that involved in the photo making. So is there a reason that in this particular work, Space of Mutation, that you decide to also have yourself being photographed?
Yeah, so I think most of the work in this series, they are mainly kind of dealing with these interior spaces. So I would say, of course, the work is about my identity of, kind of this multifaceted portrait of me, but most of them, they don't have, actually me in it as like a photographic piece. And I think the reason that I included only one image that had me, and this is one of the images that I made in the earlier stage of the project. It's like kind of the beginning part of the project. And I was both thinking about using this work to channel the previous projects I've done. Of course, all the images in this project relates to my previous work, but I think particular this work, as you can see, you see my body, you see my hand that's holding the section of the room, but also you see, I think this image crops a little bit. So beneath that green chair, there's also a hand of me that's on the floor there. So it's actually only this image between all the other photographs I made in the series. Only this image is photoshopped. So both of my hands, they exist in different photographs when I photograph them, and then eventually I combine them in post-production. But you also, of course, see in the middle right section, you see this mural. To see I have this faces there, and that's combined by I think 5 photographs. And so only this image is photoshopped. But the work, of course, is kind of thinking about how my body is changing in this space, both thinking about my teenage year, but also kind of thinking about that, how do I renegotiate my own existence in this space by doing this project. And it's also kind of, like I said, kind of charging my previous work. So if you see on the middle right section of the work, you see these tiny pieces of photograph on top of the sunset photograph, and that's actually a self-portrait I made in Chicago during the winter on the shore of South Michigan. So it's a self-portrait of me completely naked on the edge of Lake Michigan, and that's made in 2014. So thinking about how my body is, I guess it's a self-portrait of my own death, and I kind of act was to kind of considering this a fear of dealing my own my own fear of my identity at the time, but also thinking about how the media has been portraying this kind of tragedy of gay people if they exist or speak up. So I think that's something that I was thinking, but I kind of wanted to share a similar strategy to kind of connect the times.
And I think if we compare this work with the other work in the show, Open Closets, I think there are 2 things that really catch my attention. So the first thing is the amount of collage in this work is much more overwhelming than the first work that we have shown. And I wonder, how do you evaluate or design like the quantity of the collages that you use in different works? Because I think this actually symbolizes a lot of different repressed emotions or different contexts. So would you mind elaborate that?
Right. I think if so the whole series has 15 images, and if you were able to kind of put them all together, you probably can kind of tell there's like a slightly kind of progress of complexity. I think at the beginning section of the project is more in a way reserved because I was much more nervous to create the project in the space because I was always really worried about if my parents suddenly will come home from work and how, like, if they discover that, and it will be a such issue for me. And then, but the kind of later part of the project, I kind of became more and more, I guess, confident in the space, and to kind of be able to create more elaborate or intense installation in the space. So I think that's just a more kind of practical reasoning, but I think also it kind of deal with my own mentality to experience the space. The more I take up the space physically with my own images, I feel more reclaimed, and more confident about how do I guess fit in the space that didn't really give me the freedom to speak of my own sexuality or my own idea of whatever art thing that I want to do. So I think that's definitely part of the reason. And also in this particular image, it's an image made in my parents' bedroom. So there's another piece in the theory called parents' bedroom. So this piece is called open closet. So the other piece called parents' bedroom is more calm. And that's made in 2018, and this piece is made in 2019. So of course, this piece is so much more elaborate compared to the previous one. And it's from a opposite direction of the.
When you're done, they spray you like a zoo animal to get the caramel off.
Well, it's from the opposite direction of the bedroom, and to me, of course, there are image, like for instance, on the right edge of the image, you see this tiny pieces of actually an image titled The Living Room. So actually I included the previous made photograph in the series. Of course, there are also other pieces, like there are these, so there are two closets. On the left side of the closet, you see this kind of planetary imagery that's in that kind of dark, deep space. And that came from my video work. And that only made shortly before this image is made. So there are this ever growing moment in this project.
So I think when you title the series "Temporary Censored Home," it can be very symbolic, but it's also quite literal, because you also mentioned that you have to wait until your parents are not at home, so then you can, stick out all these collages in the apartment, and then you have to tidy that up before they come back. So this must be quite intense and nerve-wracking creative process. So would you mind actually share some of your feelings when or how do you feel when you're actually really need to make sure that your parents don't discover that you are creating a collage mess in the apartment?
Yeah. I mean, at the beginning of the project, like when I got back home, so I printed most of my images in Chicago, and I fold them and put them in my suitcase, and then I brought them back to Beijing. And I mean, I told my parents that I will be doing some project at home in home, and I showed them some of my landscape photographs that I made. So that is something that I did to reassure them this is a really innocent project. that I will be doing. So, and they really respect me and they trust me, right? Like, cause they, you know, of course they love me, so they trust me. So that's something that what I did to reassure them. But of course, since my father worked really close to where we live, so I mean the housing that we had is partially come from my father's job, who's uh, a military researcher, and so that's kind of came from, you know, the housing partially came from the government, and so if it's only take like probably 15 minutes to walk from his office to our home, so that's really kind of nervous to me, that he could just, you know, suddenly decide to come home and sell everything. And actually there's one time, so every time I do the project, I actually lock the door inside, and so that could buy me some time when they try to open from the outside. Like if I heard something outside, I will have more time to take off more sensitive images first. So that was my plan. But there was like only one time that I forgot to unlock when I finish the
Oh,
project, and my father came in and he said like, why did you lock the door? And I couldn't really give any reason. I just like kind of somehow refused to answer and like pretend I didn't heard that question. So that is kind of really nervous to me. But of course, like the work are always made in a sense of urgency. And in a way, it's kind of more performative. Of course, the work also, that kind of sense of urgency also emphasis by the actual photography. And that's because, you know, of course, photography has ability to capture or to record something happen just in you know, a second, and that's
mm,
something that I of course thinking about, how do I use the medium to talk about story, and also of course experience, and um yeah, so I think that's something I definitely I mean, now it's been like so long, it become like that like kind of nerve-wracking experience become more and more uh less like, I almost like at this point I almost forgot like what I felt like at the time, you know, and I haven't been back to that space for 3.5 years. And that also become really weird to look at these images I made. But that, you know, I've
mm.
neither experienced the actual space nor, you know, of course, live in that installation at all. So that become kind of surreal to me to look at these images.
Mm. I think your works definitely like have very meticulous use of spatiality. And in some of your shows, you actually literally turn your photograph into a partition in the exhibition space. So here it's, you know, your solo show temporarily censored home at Yancey Richardson Gallery in New York 2 years ago. So as you can see, like you blown up the images into a very large format and then turn it into a ceiling suspend form to create different distorted spaces. So how did you come up with this kind of presentation at the beginning?
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, the work was actually in my school in SSC, and I mean, I applied for a solo show there, and I got it, and it was like such a large space. And but the funny thing about the space is it only has three, like, so like a rectangular space. It actually only has 3 walls, and the fourth wall is just a straight front window. So there's no way I can put photographs there. So for me, I was kind of thinking about like if I could find a way to, I mean, the whole exhibition is also a combination of 3 projects. So the previous project, One into Another, which I, photographed myself with other men. And this project, Temporary Sense of Home, and also a video work, Complex Formation, which is projected on the back of the image everyone can see right now. So I was thinking about how do I combine the 3 projects in the space, but also gave the audience ability to navigate in the space. Of course, I'm thinking about the relationship between the 3 projects.
I think that's a very interesting use of works, because I think a lot of times people think of photography as very flat and it's like very image process, so it doesn't really perhaps has the dimensionality like a sculptural work will have. But here I think it really allows us to reimagine how we utilize and employ the medium photography into actually a more dimensional way to interpret it, not as a content only, but also how we can play with that very thin printed layer. Actually, although it's very thin, you can actually create this very interesting presentation in this space. And so I think after mentioning about learning about Gary's practices, I think it's very naturally that we can actually connect with Rachel's sculptures in the show. So Rachel, I must tell you that I think a lot of audience that came to see Retrograde, they're first of all very intrigued by the motions of these awkward moving plants. They didn't just take a photo that it's Instagram friendly, but they really spent time to stood there and observe these sculptures. And in this combination of the objects, we have from left to right, Notorious, Rash, Punk Drunk, Insatiable, and Possession. So I think I actually also very curious of how do you come up with the title? So is it possible to sorry, I think there's some echo, but okay. So may I know, Rachel, how do you come up with these titles?
Yeah, that's a great question. They're very kind of spur of the moment, because usually, they come from this larger installation called Gather, which I know there are images of later, but when they kind of get separated from the pack in a way, they get their own individual names and they kind of become their own personalities because they stand out as individuals. For the works in the show, I think, I was thinking about these kind of terms that feel very rapturous, because the original installation had this element of queer joy and pleasure, but also this elements of religious ecstasy. And I think that it's really kind of fun for me to tie those two together, given my very religious upbringing. And so I was thinking about how insatiable is almost this very horny thing, but there's also this thirst for God, or and enraptured, and the piece that's kind of shaking a lot is kind of could almost be in this state of ecstasy, but also in a physical way, or a spiritual way. And so yeah, that was kind of the influence for the titles here.
So I think if I remember correctly, when I was learning more of your previous practices, at the beginning of your career, you didn't really make these kind of this form of sculptures, but you have always been interested in making object-oriented works. So what's the turning point in your artistic career that you decide you would like to start this very distinct style of kinetic sculptures?
Yeah, I think my kind of origins in sculptures were really kind of like based on upsetting material expectations. And so the work I made before this and kind of like went in my undergrad was more soft sculpture. And I was thinking about kind of the expectation of something being rigid and then being like soft and gummy and like flaccid instead. And, you know, this idea of like an object being through its material. And then that kind of just really, you know, naturally morphed into this like animated quality to this work. And also because I think I wasn't just satisfied with materiality, I was also thinking really about like function and like intention in these pieces. And so, you know, that's why I started using massagers, right? It's because of their intended function and then like disrupting that. But also like there's, I don't know, I find that I have like a deep sympathy for objects, especially, I don't know, especially when they're like sad or pathetic and like, and they're, you know, there's that quality to these pieces because they're all secondhand. They're either purchased like online and through eBay, or like I actually go and meet people and give them cash for the pieces. And in a way, it's like they're kind of being sold off because they didn't do what they were supposed to do or what they were expected, which is again to like provide that bodily comfort. And so I think that I was really drawn to that kind of like sadness in that narrative, and then kind of then turning it on its head and letting that the works kind of extend and do awkward things that have nothing to do with their like original function.
So I think many of us are curious of, because all of the, I think the form of the works or even the colors of they're all intentional decisions. So how do you actually select or shortlist the massagers and the particular artificial plants?
Yeah, the massagers are a lot of trial and error. Like I just have to like buy them and run them and see how they work. And I've learned a lot about which models are good for long-term use and then which ones also burn out. Because there is also an inherent like death that is part of these works, because eventually they will short out or the motors will die because they're essentially not built to last for a really, really long time. The flowers themselves, I would say, are much more kind of like natural, like process. Like, I mean, I go to, well, I mean, it's unnatural, right? I go to like a craft store or like a supply store where they have, you know, just like hundreds and hundreds of like fake flowers, which, you know, in normal circumstances, you would never have that many diverse flowers in one space because like you can't actually do that because of the way they grow. But yeah, it's like when you have the artificial version, you can have whatever you want. And so I go through and I pick things, you know, based on color, but also like in a way, I think that the plants that I choose like have this like inherent queerness to them. Like it's not just about how they move, but also, you know, the ways that like sexuality is projected onto flowers, or the ways that we see those kind of we see our own like biology mimicked in nature. You know, I definitely avoid things that are too like bridal or like floral or whatever, like, you know, in the kind of traditional sense. And I'm always kind of going for those like weirder, more like alien like flowers. And some of it is also influenced by like my grandmother really loves like doing floral arrangements, and she like loves tropical and like exotic flowers. And so I think that also kind of like imprinted on me when I was young.
So briefly mentioned just now that you're actually quite interested in terms of presenting failure or talking about failure in your series. So I remember when I was doing a research of, you know, your background and practices, there was always a phrase that usually maybe or your articles or features will always mention, which is that your work is kind of echoing your father's failed American dream as a let's say a Korean diaspora. Is it possible to illustrate a little bit more of that kind of interpretation? Because in the show, although I also interpret failure in a work, but it's more talking about the kind of bounded relationship of queerness in relation to failure. So in a more personal level, how does that translate in your objects?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think, yeah, I think there's, you know, this kind of understanding that the American dream doesn't exist, and that it's like, I don't know, this farce thing that people pursue. And, you know, for my dad, like he like loves Trump and like really identifies with this like weird kind of like false idea of like success and being like a businessman and entrepreneur. But it's like, and he's a pastor, right? So it's like his job is literally to like be very convincing and you know, preach things that like, you know, based off of a, you know, a religion that people are, you know, has many followers. And so, you know, I think a lot of that kind of, especially my earlier work before this, was influenced by like the fact that my dad always like filled our homes with these like cheap replicas of like statues like the David or the Venus de Milo, or like he would have a lot of army memorabilia or just like things to, I think, him like signaled like success, or like almost like having like a vast collection of objects. But then ultimately, you know, they're like these cheap plastic replicas, like they're just like sold, like they're made in a factory and then they're like sold at Hobby Lobby, which is like a big craft store in the US. And so you know, that's really kind of where I understood failure and aspiration. And also because these machines, you know, they labor, like they are non-sentient, but also like there's this idea that they're working, they're generating heat, they're supposed to provide a function, and then they can't do that. I think in kind of relation to queerness, like I think a lot about how like I've grown up unable to like express myself through my body just because of like a lot of shame and repression, and I don't know, just like maybe like lack of like physical touch and like intimacy and stuff. So you know, there's something about letting these pieces just like do their awkward thing. Like, you know, there's a soundtrack, but they're like not on beat and they're like smacking into each other and breaking each other. And like, that's kind of like more accurate to like my like queerness, like rather than, you know, any super like romanticized like perfection. Like, I don't know, like I think there's, you know, growing up in heteronormative society, which is like for like the most part, like everywhere, like there's a established kind of choreography of like what that looks like and how to do it. And then like for queerness, it is like, even if there's like more queer representation in media, it's like still not how I go about it. And you know, it's often too idealistic. And so I think I really like to highlight just the awkward kind of weirdness of navigating all of that.
Yeah, I really have like also kind of get all of these ideas when I see your works, even just on Instagram, because like despite like the very upbeat, energetic club track soundtrack that usually play in these exhibitions, but there's always, it's not just about the energy, but at the same time there is a very underlying sense of melancholia actually. If audience observes the whole set for a long time, so it's not just like, oh, you know, it's funky, but it actually has a sense of sadness and kind of almost trying to embrace a certain failure of some sort. And I think that that's a very strong idea from the works.
Yeah, a lot of that is also expressed through the audio. Like what's most present when you enter like this installation that's pictured here is that you hear like dance music, and that's, you know, something that's meant to be like more club-like and celebratory. But there's also spliced into the audio like clips of like Korean church services where like people are like praying in mass or like wailing, and like, you know, they're in Korea, they do very like large mass prayers that are very emotional and collective. And to me, like the show was not only about like creating like a queer safe dance space, but also like reconciling the ways that people like express their bodies in collective movements and ecstasy and release. And like, you know, me growing up, I witnessed that in the church, because there's also this like idea of like, you know, Korean people expressing their anguish of like being immigrants and being like lonely in a country, or, you know, being occupied by, you know, colonist countries. So there's just like this inherent kind of frustration that is like attributed to Korean people because of those histories. And I think that's also a reason why like everybody like prays together like that. So in a way, like I was trying to kind of link that with queer like bodily release, because in my mind those used to be such oppositional forces, but in a way they are enmeshed and much more similar than people would expect.
So first of all, congratulations again for having Sturgis Daughters to represent you, at the same time having a solo show right now in New York. What I really want to highlight in this show compared to your previous works is that you include such a different element this time when dealing with the artificial plants, motions and movements. So you actually include like metal fasteners or certain physical limitations to the plants, so that they're compared to perhaps the previous showcase in Berlin, or even at our current show Retrograde, the plants cannot really move according to the massager's mechanics. They're kind of trapped in some sort. But it may be fun to look at, but I actually feel a certain undertone of violence. So I would love to know more about the decision of including this element in this solo show.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think for this work, I kind of really just like leaned away from like toxic positivity and being like everything's fine, to just like kind of embracing like me being in a weird transition in my life, but also like everything else that's going on that is horrible. And so it ended up manifesting in this work that is like a lot to influence from like the flowers and the massagers, but also there's lots of metal components, whether it's these kind of like thin stems you see in this image, or it's a lot of like some of the other pieces in the show are like my flower pieces restrained by like exercise equipment, or like a pull-up bar, or a hand strengthener, or like they almost look like medieval torture devices / like BDSM things, like. And so I think I really kind of wanted to show more of that labor and that struggle, and let it be less joyful and expressive, and let it be more bound. And this work came about right kind of before the Roe v. Wade thing happened in the US, and then abortion was just like overturned just like that. And there's kind of like an inherent, or like a very kind of immediate like frustration, as like somebody who was born as a woman and like a feminist, to like having choice ripped away from me, but also a personal just like absolute frustration with being really bound to my own body and biology, whereas birth control and things like that can like suppress those things, and I almost don't have to like be kind of enslaved to like what my body is meant to do. But yeah, all those complex feelings were really kind of manifesting in this work.
And I'm quite interested in knowing a little bit more about the wall pieces, because right now in our show we have the works are more like installed on top of the speakers on the floor, but here at least from this image you see like free works are installed on a wall. What kind of a different kind of motion or vibe that they actually give out compared to the other works on the floor?
Yeah, the one that's kind of in the center is an example of the pieces that are kind of like what traditionally look like my work from before, and then bound by metal. And so a lot of that is like actually like reliant on being restricted to a wall or to a surface, rather than being like freestanding and free like they are in the show at Galerie du Monde. The two pieces that flank that work, I don't know, are kind of a departure. Like to me, they feel like almost like they're plants, but also they feel like antlers, like for like a trophy head of an animal that you would like put up on the wall. And if you see the works in motion, they kind of have this like piece extends that looks like a tongue, almost like it's a pink leaf that is continually like licking, or it looks like it's licking these pieces of glass like slag rock, which are like a kind of a byproduct of like glass casting. And so you know, I was interested in thinking about like salt licks, which are you know, ways to lure in animals, to where like you put a salt lick out for like a deer and it'll come and it'll lick it to get the essential nutrients. But also the idea that like if you continue to do that, you would like you know, harm your body. And so I don't know, I think I'm thinking a lot in my work, there are these ideas of like predetermined failure or like labor towards like destruction. And so, you know, that's kind of what's emerging from this work now.
I think this is a wonderful presentation because there's definitely a more darker undertone in this set of works, and I think it really allows viewers to see beyond that kind of usually like joyful, you know, club dance music scene that you used to present. So talking about music, I remember like back then you will actually like to work perhaps with a Hong Kong songwriter, musician to collaborate with the soundtrack. And when I heard that, I was like, that's a good idea. But I was like, rather than working with one, why not work with 24? So I took the lead, and you know, if for those who are able to visit the show in person, you will actually hear a lingering soundtrack and a backdrop of you know, a playlist with 24 canto pop songs. And I think, you know, although Rachel, you may not understand Cantonese, but I'm sure if you listen to the whole soundtrack, there's a certain melancholic or pathetic almost kind of ambience that we created together. And although at the same time the sculptures may not move exactly as this, you know, it's not synchronized with the music, the rhythm, but there's a very very calming, but at the same time stirring a lot of emotional turbulence if you have the patience to listen through the whole playlist. So perhaps, you know, just to let the audience know a little bit of why we come up with this kind of collaboration is that I think historically, you know, Hong Kong is very queer, not in a sense that it's particularly open-minded, but you know, historically, you know, we're used to be a British colony, and then we are now, you know, part of you know, China, and there's always that kind of weird transitional stage that we don't really know what's going on. At the same time, it seems to be very difficult to have your own definition, you know, as a you know, as a city that has improved so much. But at the same time, it's because of this impossibility of having a definition or a resistance of definition that I find it very queer. And although this is like a very failed presentation of a city, but through this failure, there actually is an opportunity to nurture something that's unknown, that it's so powerful that it's difficult to forecast or speculate. And I think that actually really resonate really well with Rachel's kinetic sculptures in the show. So in this playlist, I intend to only include two types of singers. They're all Hong Kong singers, but either they are part of the LGBTQ community or they are mainly female singers or celebrities that have a very huge queer fan base. But sonically, it's also telling a very interesting story, you know, of perhaps there are songs that talk about that kind of ambivalent relationship between gay people, or a slightly more rebellious interpretation of, you know, sex and gender. At the same time, there are more bittersweet stories of lesbian couples or gay couples, but all the way up to the, you know, to more the second half of the playlist. There are songs that actually talk a lot about that kind of pathetic, failed self that is unable to be successful or to be productive. And they, rather than trying to be successful, they allow themselves to kind of indulge in that state of failure. Although they're using a romantic relationship as a metaphor, but that kind of storyline thing, it really works well, not only with Rachel's set of sculptures in the show, but actually creating certain dialogue with other artists in Retrograde. So I think that's a very interesting and very new take of how we present Rachel's work. So I think if, again, if you have a chance to visit the show in person, please definitely come by and experience that yourself.
Yeah, I really welcome the opportunity to work collaboratively with the curator, and also because like I'm not a musician, and like, you know, for me, like I like putting trust in people who know what they're doing. But it was really great to be like more in kind of this like nuanced like relationship with like Hong Kong music and Cantonese, because ultimately like my lens of like Asia is like very distorted through like my parents, and like they're, you know, they will convince me that Korea is like a very strictly Christian, like, you know, very like regimented country, and like, you know, they would drop dead before they would like admit that like queer people exist naturally in Korea. And so it's really cool to like to experience that, but also I just love the actual installation of it, because it's like there's this like really great soundtrack, but then like this almost like very harsh spotlight that's like highlighting those pieces.
Yeah.
But they're just like they like don't know what to do. They're like, you know, they're just dancing
they're kind
awkwardly.
of exposed.
Yeah, it's like almost like because, you know, in the other installation it's very dark, there's colorful lighting, it's like, you know, you can go to a club and like descend into the darkness, and then this is like if you just flip the lights on and like in the club, and then like, you know, everybody's just like frozen, like I don't know, there's kind of this weird kind of expose feeling to it that I really love.
So we actually have, for the moment, 2 questions from our audience. So I think we can address them first before we go through other discussions. So SY will have a question for Gary. So she would like to know, when you're putting photographs up at your parents' apartment in Beijing, how do you know when you're done composing the space with the images? When do you know it's time to stop?
Thank you, Swai, for the question. So I think it's all sort of different, but I think overall my own process was there are always a certain strategy that I was thinking about. Like, for instance, the image we saw, the spatial mutation that I had my physical body there is actually rather a simple image with just few images, but also a combination of family photographs, magazines that I collected. So I think I was thinking about, I just use the essential elements of different category of images I want to put in the work, and also my body. So that was something that I kind of sort of just already planned and already thought through when I made the work. But there are also work that's more intuitive, that I kind of started with a certain image in a particular part of the space, and then I started to kind of put out images in a more intuitive way, both thinking about how do I use my image to take over the space in a more kind of emotional and bodily process, but also thinking about how the images I chose to put up there and how do they in dialogue with each other. So it's always kind of this kind of mix of strategy, and that's something that I both really like and don't like as a person. And then kind of I'm a person who always overthink in terms of making work. But then I like, when I actually make work, I realize it's probably better if I just go with my feeling. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to actually make decisions. So in that sense, I like the constraint of the time and urgency in the process of making the work, but also I try to trust and I try to believe in my own taste in that way, in terms of how do I eventually build up the work.
So to answer another audience question, Ray's question, so Gary actually set up these collages physically in a space, as he just mentioned, and I think only the workspace of mutation that you use Photoshop to edit your hands and the fragmented mirror portrait image, right? So others
Yes.
are all kind of physically done.
Yeah.
We have another question from Yalin, thank you. So she's also quite interested in Gary's work in terms of your experience between, you know, being in the States and China. And she would like to know if the experience in the US have a crucial influence on your creation. And is the different vibe between the States and China, especially your particularly relatively more conservative family, that stimulate you to do this more provocative way of creating works? Would you mind elaborate a little bit or explain to the audience? Thank you.
Yes, of course. I mean, I think it's always in this ambivalence, I would say. I think the ambivalence of figuring out my identity here, you know, both figuring out my, you know, more professional life, but also my sexuality and how people perceive me here and how do I fit into the community here. I think that is both a liberating experience, but also is really struggling and constantly figuring out my own positioning. And I think that practice eventually gave me actually more agency. I would say that I become more understanding and critical about how the environment, how the society define and constrain me, and how do I react to it or think about that. And eventually that, of course, experience kind of helped me to confront my past, right? Like my own experience in China when I grew up, and my relationship with my family, and how do I exist when I go back. So I feel like that's something both liberating, but also, of course, it's struggling.
I actually have a question for both Rachel and Gary. As I noticed that although you guys are using completely different type of medium, or you know, or have a completely different idea of making the works, there is not only about the tone, the violence, but also there is a sense of schizophrenia in it. So, for example, for Rachel's sculptures, you know, if we also take your background into account, you are, you know, although you have a Korean heritage, but you actually you haven't been to Korea at all, and you don't really speak Korean language. And a lot of times, you know, being maybe an Asian American, I think sometimes you may be criticized of why you don't speak your mother tongue. So in a way, it's kind of like oh, am I like being a failure of not honoring my heritage as much? And there's always like that kind of fragmented selves going on. And for Gary, similarly, although not in terms of language, but you know, in my interpretation, collage is actually a very, very violent technique in creating works, because you are basically, in a way, tearing and compressing different space and time, and then you compress them into a completely different a form. And in a way, it's similar to the idea of schizophrenia, of how you're completely fragmented. through interpretation of the space. So a question for both Rachel and Gary is that despite it can be quite a turbulence going through this kind of self doubt or frustration of, you know, being with an identity of a, you know, Asian queer artist or Asian American. How do you unlock or unearth something that is you know, something powerful or something imaginative from this kind of failed or schizophrenic state? I'm kind of interested to know more about that. Maybe if Rachel don't mind, would you mind go first?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and even like thinking about like the term, like the word fragmentation, because I feel like I've spent a lot of time thinking about like that I am not a fragmented identity. Like, you know, there's a wholeness in like me being Asian American, even if like I can't speak my mother tongue, or, you know, when I can't speak to my grandparents. So yeah, I guess oh my gosh, I had a thought and then I totally lost it. Can you repeat the question? Or yes, I'm sorry.
So like with like being in that kind of failed identity or schizophrenic identity of being an Asian American or Asian queer artist, how what kind of power or what kind of new potential you may find from this kind of failed state?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I the thought came back. I think I'm really influenced by Jack Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure, which is basically him going through talking about like how these instances of failure are just new ways of being, and like kind of comparing yourself against the dominant culture as being like right or wrong is not productive, or like, and you know, like, and I think I've grown up with a lot of like shame, again, not knowing how to like speak Korean and all that. And so you know, in a way, it's like a lot of people here of the diaspora are like forging a new path ahead, and like you can't necessarily like think of it as like correct or incorrect. You just have to like kind of go with it. And so yeah, like that's queer failure is just like a new path. And you know, I'd like to think that these sculptures like kind of exist in this gray area between like celebration and failure and sadness, because that's ultimately like how queerness is. It's much more complex than, you know, a narrative of like victory or success.
Wonderful. So Gary, what about you? What thoughts do you have in terms of this context?
I mean, I personally, I mean, I've never actually saw Rachel's work, but I'm so intrigued and want to see the actual work. I'm so curious about like how would the work end up in the end of the exhibition. I feel like that's the kind of the new potentiality, like how much does the system well, and eventually was something new is generated in terms of something that's like, of course, like working with more kinetic arts or like art and technologies, there's like always this trial and error and this like figure out how the feedback loop is, you know, like how do you deal with that and how do you embrace something that's like surprising. I feel like for me, that's also part of, I guess, my work in terms of figuring out installation in a really constrained moment. And that's, of course, related to the idea of constraint, freedom, right? Like how much time I can be free in my parents' home to put up this work, and then suddenly I have to eliminate that. But of course, the photography captured that. But I think for me, it's this constantly, like to answer your question, is this feeling of constantly, I mean, there's like different stages of my life. Like I feel like, oh, in the earlier grad school time, I was really nihilistic. You know, I try to absorb more information and knowledge and figure out things. But then I realized there's like not much to do, and there's like, how do I, counter Trump, right? Like that was like 2018, and like how do I kind of counter that narrative, and that rise of alt-right moments, and also the constantly debate between China and US, and that escalation that's happening. Of course, like that always happens, but it depends on how different government reacts. But I think that's something that's, I guess, I don't know, like for sensitive people, those questions always there. And then versus people who are really strong in terms of opinion and decide what's normal, what's not normal, like what's the idea of sexuality and what's the normal sexuality, and who should be deciding who can get abortion, right? Like those are kind of really privileged and restrictful power that's controlling our body. So I feel like there's always this debate between the two, and of course it's easier to believe in just one idea and hold a strong opinion to it. But I feel like that's always not works for me. But like I feel like in my teenage year, I kind of sort of believed in that, just to make myself feel safe. And but I feel like a vulnerability is really important, and accessibility is so important, and it helps me to figure out who I am and how to make it work. But of course, that's always really difficult.
So you talk about the kind of like the controlling element in your work, because when you design the space, it's quite peculiar. You're not just laying out the collages randomly. So Kelvin has a question for you. So because your work involved element of performance in a way, because you're turning the whole room into a stage in a way, but also by creating this collage infused space, it's also an installation of some sort. But why do you choose to use photography as the kind of final medium?
Yeah, I'm just, I guess, two answers to that. So first, as a practical answer, I'm trained as a photographer and I like photography. And the second question will be, the second answer would be, interested in how photography could be this almost like an analogy that I think I mentioned earlier in the talk, that the short amount of freedom I experience in the space to put up the work is kind of similar to what photography could do, what the camera could do, that just like this 1 second of exposure of the lights, my strobe lights, shine on the whole space, and then it goes to black, and then the camera, the film captures the imagery, and then it's all gone. So if you like that short amount of time and short amount of freedom, that's also something that I was thinking about to incorporate in the narrative.
So one last question, which is for Rachel, also by from Kelvin. So other movements of the works originate from the natural original setting of the massagers, or you actually modify some of the mechanics and change the movements to fit certain aesthetic?
Yeah, I'll answer that question, and then I also kind of want to go back to like talking about what Gary was mentioning. But
yeah, sure.
Basically they are the original settings of the machines. Like in a way I also like use these pieces because like I'm not an engineer and I like cannot like fabricate these myself. Like I like to use pre-existing motions because that gives me a set of limitations. And yeah, you know, for the most part, the variations on those are like you can reverse the motion of things, but generally they're pretty much not modified that much. But I guess so. I was really kind of like taken by this question about using photography for Gary's work too, because like in a way there's this like problem or question of archive with our works, right? Because it's like, is Gary's work the installation or is it the photograph of the installation? And ultimately like Gary has to do that because it must be taken down before the parents come home. And it's like this whole kind of like race against time. And you know, I think about that with my work a lot. Like that's often a question that comes up is like whether, you know, the inherent non-archivalness of like these pieces because they are machines that have like a lifespan to them. And I don't know, like in a way, like the way people like take videos of that work or take photos of it, like that's the way that it continues to like exist once like the piece, you know, reaches its kind of like inherent machine death. And yeah, it's interesting to think about like collecting it because it's like you wouldn't, you know, you can buy a car, but you know it's not going to last you forever. And you know, there's this idea that art must be everlasting and be in a mode of stasis. And I really kind of also like defying that too, because I don't know, I feel like in a way I was having this conversation with somebody this week. I was just like, who cares if it's not archival or like, you know, if it doesn't end up in the canon in a textbook or something. Like that's you know, that's not the most important thing to me with that work.
So, well, first of all, lastly, thank you again, Rachel and Gary, to first of all agree to participate in Retrograde, and thank you again for your time to bear with the time zone differences to participate this talk. And of course, thanks to all the audience, especially if you know, that's they're in US time zones. Thank you for those who are in the East Coast with the 12-hour difference. It's midnight for you. So just a little bit more promotion of the show. It will end on the 13th of August. And if you're in Hong Kong, please visit the show in person. And we do have a couple more talks upcoming in the upcoming weeks with various artists. So please do follow the galleries or my social media for any updates. And for those in Hong Kong, we're actually gonna have a tour led by me at 3:30 today at the gallery. So if you managed to drop by, please come. We'd love to see you as well. So thank you so much again for everyone's participation, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much. Have a nice day and have a nice evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.